The entire kingdom stood in absolute silence as the Alpha King chose another woman. Not his mate, not the girl fate had bound to him since birth. He stood before the high altar of House Frost, his broad shoulders draped in black furs, his jaw set in stone. And as the heavy gold crown was placed on the wrong head, a sharp, terrible sound echoed from the back of the great hall. His true mate collapsed, choking on her own breath. Her name was Ellen, the weakest girl in the pack, soft-spoken, invisible, easy to ignore. But the moon goddess had made one thing undeniably clear. She was his. The true mate of the most powerful Alpha King in the realm. But power has a way of blinding men. King Asriel didn't hesitate. Standing before the entire court, he took Lady Bianca's hand, beautiful, powerful, and politically perfect. I, Asriel, reject you, Ellen, as my mate. The words echoed like a death sentence. A sharp, ragged cry tore from Ellen's lips as the bond snapped. But not cleanly, not completely, because something went wrong. That night, Ellen couldn't breathe. Her chest burned like fire, her weak wolf whimpered, fading into the dark. And across the castle, King Asriel froze mid-step. A strange, agonizing pain gripped his heart, tight, suffocating. He ignored it. He was the king. He did not succumb to weakness. But as the days passed, and his rejected mate grew colder, slipping closer and closer to death, the Alpha King began to realize one terrifying truth. When you sever a soul in two, both halves bleed. Chapter 1. The scent of crushed pine and winter frost, Asriel's scent, was suffocating in the great hall. Aelin stood perfectly still at the very edge of the crowd, her hands trembling so violently she had to bury them deep in the folds of her simple, faded gray dress. She shouldn't have come. She knew that. Sorin, the king's beta, had warned her to stay in her quarters. He had looked at her with pity in his eyes, a pity that made Aelin's stomach twist, and told her it would be better if she didn't witness the coronation. But she couldn't stay away. The mate bond, that invisible, burning thread connecting her ribs to his, had dragged her here. It was a physical compulsion. Her wolf, small and timid as it was, needed to see him, needed to be near him. At the front of the hall, Asriel looked like a god of war. Tall, lethal, his dark hair brushing the collar of his ceremonial armor. His eyes, a piercing, icy blue, swept over the gathered nobility with absolute authority. He was the Alpha King of House Frost, a conqueror who had united the northern territories through sheer, brutal force. And beside him stood Lady Bianca. Aelin's chest ached just looking at her. Bianca was everything Aelin was not. Tall, confident, her golden hair woven with jewels, radiating the heavy, intoxicating scent of night-blooming jasmine and pure, unfiltered ambition. She was the daughter of the wealthiest lord in the south, a political masterpiece. Aelin's wolf whines, a pathetic, desperate sound echoing in the back of her mind. "Mate," the wolf cried, scratching at the inside of Aelin's chest. "Go to him. He is ours." Aelin forced herself to take a shallow breath, but the air felt thin. She pressed her back against the cold stone pillar, trying to make herself as small as possible. "We are not enough," Aelin told her wolf silently. "Look at her. Look at him. We are nothing." But then, Asriel's eyes shifted. Across the sea of nobles, across the vast expanse of the marble floor, his icy blue gaze found Aelin's. The temperature in the room plummeted. For one heartbeat, time stopped entirely. The bond flared between them, hot and bright and undeniably real. Aelin felt a sudden, desperate surge of hope. She felt the heavy, thudding rhythm of his heartbeat sync perfectly with her own. He felt it too. She knew he did. The way his pupils dilated, the way his broad chest completely stopped moving. Please, Aelin thought, her heart hammering against her ribs. Please, Asriel. Instead, Asriel's jaw tightened. The muscle ticked in his cheek. His gaze, which had been wide and unguarded for a fraction of a second, went completely dead. He locked his emotions behind an impenetrable wall of ice, his eyes going flat and cruel. He turned away from her. Aelin felt the blood drain from her face. She watched, paralyzed, as Asriel extended his large, scarred hand and took Bianca's. The high priest stepped forward, his voice carrying over the breathless crowd. My king, have you made your choice? I have, Asriel said. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and straight into Aelin's bones. And what of the fate the moon goddess decreed? The priest asked cautiously, following the ancient rites. What of the mate bound to your soul? Bianca's lips curved into a triumphant smirk. She didn't even bother to look back at Aelin. She didn't need to. Asriel turned his head, looking back out into the crowd. He didn't look at Aelin's face. He looked at the space just beside her, refusing to meet her eyes. I, Asriel of House Frost, his voice boomed, sharp and merciless, reject you, Aelin, as my mate. The words didn't just echo. They hit Aelin with physical, devastating force. It felt as though a massive, invisible hand had reached through her ribs, grabbed her beating heart, and crushed it. A sharp, ragged cry tore from her lips, loud and broken and humiliating. She couldn't stop it. Her legs gave out instantly, and she collapsed to her knees on the polished stone, her hands clutching her chest. Around her, the crowd gasped. Nobles stepped back, pulling their silk robes away from her as if her rejection were a disease they might catch. Whispers erupted. Pity, disgust, mockery. But Aelin couldn't hear them. There was only a high-pitched ringing in her ears. The bond snapped. But it didn't snap cleanly. It wasn't the swift, merciful severing of a tie. Because Aelin was too weak, her wolf too small to accept the sheer force of an Alpha King's rejection, the bond didn't break. It shattered. It frayed like a thick, glowing rope under too much tension, splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces that curled back and lodged themselves deep into her veins like poisoned glass. She curled into a ball on the floor, gasping. Air wouldn't fill her lungs. Every breath felt like inhaling razor blades. Her chest burned with a toxic, consuming fire. Inside her mind, her wolf let out one final, agonizing howl of pure despair, and then went completely, terrifyingly silent, fading into the dark. Through her blurred, tear-filled vision, Aelin saw Soren push through the crowd. The beta dropped to his knees beside her, his face pale with shock. Aelin. Soren's voice was muffled, distant. He reached for her, his hands hovering over her trembling body. Gods, what has he done? Healer! Get a healer! Aelin tried to speak, tried to tell Soren that it was too late, that her soul was bleeding out on the marble floor. But her vision tunneled. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her entirely was the glint of gold, the crown, being placed upon Bianca's head. Chapter 2. That night, the royal palace of House Frost was divided into two completely different worlds. In the grand banquet hall, there was music, wine, and the roaring laughter of a court celebrating their new, powerful queen. And in a small, draughty servants' room, in the deepest, most forgotten wing of the castle, there was only silence. Elin lay on a narrow cot, unmoving. The royal healers had come, poured their potions down her throat, cast their diagnostic spells, and then backed away with grim, helpless expressions. "Her wolf is dying," the oldest healer had whispered to Soren in the hallway, thinking Elin was too far gone to hear. The rejection was too forceful. Her body cannot sustain the shock of a shattered bond. She is fading, Beta Soren. It is only a matter of days, perhaps hours. Elin stared at the cracked wooden ceiling. She couldn't cry anymore. She didn't have the strength. Her skin was freezing to the touch, her fingertips tinged with blue. Her once warm, expressive brown eyes had dulled to a flat, vacant stare. She felt hollowed out, as if someone had scooped out her insides and left only a brittle shell behind. She stopped eating. When the maids brought her broth, she simply turned her face to the wall. She stopped speaking. There was no point. The only person her soul wanted to speak to had thrown her away. Her body grew fragile, her pulse slowing to a weak, stuttering rhythm, like a clock winding down. She was slowly disappearing, and she welcomed it. Meanwhile, 3 floors above her, the Alpha King was fighting a war he didn't understand. Asriel stood in his private study, the heavy oak door locked behind him. He poured himself a 3rd glass of amber whiskey, his large hand trembling so violently the crystal glass clinked against the decanter. "Damn it," he cursed, slamming the glass down onto the desk. He gripped the edge of the mahogany wood, his knuckles turning white as a sudden violent spasm of pain seized his chest. It drove the breath from his lungs. He gritted his teeth, his jaw locking as he forced himself to stay standing. It had started the moment he spoke the rejection, a strange, sharp tug behind his ribs. He had ignored it. He was the king. He had crushed rebellions, slaughtered rogue armies, and conquered the wildlands. He did not succumb to phantom pains. But as the days passed, the pain didn't fade. It mutated. It grew into a suffocating, crushing weight. It felt as though his lungs were filling with ice water. His legendary strength, the raw, feral power that made him the most feared alpha in a century, felt sluggish, heavy. There was a sharp knock at the door. "My king!" Soren's voice called from the corridor. Asriel straightened up instantly. He wiped the sweat from his brow, adjusted his dark tunic, and forced his breathing to slow. He buried the agony behind his iron walls. "Enter," he commanded, his voice perfectly flat. Soren stepped into the room. The Beta looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed. He carried a stack of reports, but he didn't look at them. He looked at Asriel. "The Eastern Border Lords have sent their congratulations on your mating, sire," Soren said carefully. "And Queen Bianca wishes to know if you will be joining her in her chambers tonight." Asriel's stomach turned. The mere thought of Bianca's jasmine scent made his wolf snarl with uncharacteristic violence. "Tell her I am occupied with state matters," Asriel said coldly. "I will sleep in my own quarters." Soren nodded slowly. He set the reports on the desk. He lingered, shifting his weight. "Is there something else, Soren?" Asriel snapped, the pain in his chest flaring again. "It's Elin, sire," Soren said softly. Asriel froze. The name hit him like a physical blow. His scent, usually a crisp, controlled winter chill, soured with a sudden spike of distress. He immediately locked it down. "I told you," Asriel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous warning growl. "She is no longer my concern. Her fate is her own." "She is dying, Asriel," Soren said, abandoning royal titles. The Beta's voice was thick with suppressed anger. "The healers say she won't make it through the week. She hasn't eaten. She hasn't spoken. Her wolf is gone." Asriel couldn't breathe. The room tilted dangerously. He turned his back to his Beta, gripping the windowsill, staring out into the dark, snow-covered mountains. Dying. The word echoed in his skull. "Make sure she is comfortable," Asriel managed to say, his voice rigid and devoid of emotion. "Give the healers whatever resources they need, but do not speak to me of her again. You are dismissed." Soren stared at the king's broad back for a long, heavy moment. Disappointment practically rolled off the beta in waves. "As you wish, my king," Soren whispered, and left the room. When the door clicked shut, Asriel's knees finally buckled. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, clutching his chest as a wave of pure, unadulterated agony ripped through him. His wolf howled inside his mind, a frantic, desperate sound. He couldn't sleep. He hadn't slept in 4 days. Every time he closed his eyes, the exact same nightmare dragged him under. Elin, tiny and broken, lying lifeless in his arms, her beautiful brown eyes staring up at him, dead and glassy. And his hands, his massive, scarred hands, covered in her blood. He would wake up thrashing, drenched in cold sweat, his throat raw from screaming a name he had forbidden himself to speak. "I did what I had to do," Asriel told himself desperately, pressing his forehead against the cold stone floor of his study. "I need a strong queen. I need power. She was too weak. She would have been a target. I did it for the kingdom." But as another crushing wave of pain radiated from his heart, the Alpha King coughed, a wet, rattling sound. He pulled his hand away from his mouth. In the dim light of the fireplace, Asriel stared at his palm. It was covered in blood. Chapter 3. On the evening of the 5th day, the heavy oak doors of the royal war room burst open with such force they cracked against the stone walls. Asriel was leaning over a massive map of the Northern Territories, surrounded by his generals. He looked up, his eyes flashing with lethal irritation. No one entered the war room unannounced, but it wasn't a soldier. It was the royal healer, an elderly woman named Maeve, who had served House Frost since Asriel was a child. She ignored the heavily armed generals, her face ashen, her breathing ragged. She marched straight up to the map table. "My king," Maeve gasped, falling into a hurried bow. "You must come at once. It's the rejected mate, Elin. She is in her final hours." Asriel's jaw tightened so hard his teeth ached. He didn't look up from the map. He couldn't let his generals see the tremor in his hands. He forced his voice to remain flat, absolute, the voice of a tyrant. "I gave you my orders, Maeve. Make her comfortable. She is nothing to me. Her fate is out of my hands." Maeve didn't leave. She stood back up, trembling under the crushing weight of Asriel's alpha aura, which was leaking into the room, thick and suffocating. The generals exchanged nervous glances, slowly stepping back from the table. "Sire," Maeve said, her voice shaking but defiant, "with all due respect, if she is nothing to you, then why are you dying with her?" The entire room went dead silent. Asriel froze. His hands, braced flat against the edges of the map table, went completely still. He slowly lifted his head, his dark, icy eyes narrowing on the old woman. "Explain yourself," Asriel commanded softly. Maeve swallowed hard, stepping closer. "You've been coughing blood, haven't you? You can't sleep. Your chest feels as though it is being crushed." Asriel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The shock in his eyes betrayed him. "The bond didn't break, sire," Maeve whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Because the girl was too weak to process the trauma of the rejection. The bond didn't sever. It fractured. It's bleeding out inside her." Asriel's heart stopped. "She is your true mate, Asriel," Maeve continued, abandoning protocol, her voice cracking. Your soul is tied to hers on a level older than the laws of this court. Because the bond is fractured, her life force is draining away, and because you are tethered to her. Maeve looked at the king with absolute terror. If she takes her last breath tonight, your heart will stop beating the moment hers does. If she dies, so will you. For the first time in his entire brutal, blood-soaked, conquering life, the Alpha King felt true, paralyzing fear. The maps on the table were scattered to the floor as Azriel moved. He didn't issue orders. He didn't call for Soren. He didn't even look at his generals. He just ran. Azriel tore out of the war room, a blur of dark muscle and sheer feral panic. He vaulted down the grand staircases, his boots slamming against the stone. Guards scrambled out of his way, terrified by the sheer, unadulterated violence radiating from their king. The pain in his chest was excruciating now. It was no longer a dull ache. It was a physical tether, a burning chain wrapped around his ribs, pulling him downward toward the servants' wing. Mate, his wolf roared, clawing at the inside of his skull, wild and completely unhinged. Dying. Mate is dying. Run! Azriel crashed into the damp, dimly lit corridor of the lowest level. He didn't bother with the handle of the small wooden door at the end of the hall. He hit it with his shoulder, tearing the door completely off its iron hinges. Azriel stopped dead in the doorway. What he saw shattered him completely. Ellen lay on a tiny, lumpy cot in the corner of the freezing room. She looked so incredibly small. Her skin was the color of ash, her lips tinged with blue. Her breathing was so shallow, so faint, it was barely a flutter beneath her thin blanket. She looked like she had already crossed over. Azriel dropped to his knees beside the bed. The impact bruised his bone against the stone floor, but he felt nothing. Nothing but the agonizing void where her bright, beautiful life force used to be. Ellen, he choked out. No response. He reached out with shaking hands, hands that had snapped necks and wielded broadswords without a second thought, and gently, terrified he might break her, cupped her face. She was like ice. His control broke. The great Alpha King, the tyrant of House Frost, folded entirely. A raw, broken sob tore from his throat. Ellen, please, he begged, leaning over her, his tears falling hot and fast against her freezing cheeks. I didn't know. By the goddess, Ellen, I didn't know. Wake up, look at me. Her eyelashes fluttered. It took monumental effort, but slowly, agonizingly, her eyes opened just a fraction. They were clouded, distant. She looked at the massive, terrifying king kneeling on her dirty floor, weeping over her. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye, tracking down her pale temple. You chose her, Aelin whispered. The words were barely a breath, fragile and broken, but they hit Azriel like a physical blow to the stomach. I was never enough. That destroyed him. No, Azriel cried out, gripping her cold hand and pressing it desperately to his lips, kissing her knuckles, her palm, bathing her skin in his tears. No, you were everything. You are everything. I was blind. I was arrogant and stupid and too blind to see you. He pressed his forehead against hers. His aura, usually dominant and crushing, shifted completely. He wrapped it around her like a warm, desperate shield, trying to pour his own heat into her freezing body. Please, Azriel begged, his voice a ruined rasp. Please, don't leave me. I take it back. Do you hear me? I take it back. The rejection, the crown, all of it. I take it back. He squeezed his eyes shut, pouring every ounce of his soul, his magic, and his screaming wolf into the fractured, bleeding space between them. My wolf, my soul, chooses you. Only you. You are my mate. The air in the tiny room went dead still. The fractured bond, hanging by a single, fraying thread, trembled. It flickered like a dying ember catching the wind. Then, snap. It slammed back into place. A shockwave of pure, golden energy blasted through the room, rattling the small window and blowing the candle out. Air rushed into Aylin's lungs with a sharp, desperate gasp. Her back arched off the cot, her body jolting violently as life returned. The magic of the healed bond flooded her veins like liquid fire. The icy blue faded from her lips, and color crept rapidly back into her cheeks. Asriel let out a broken, shuddering breath. He hauled her up from the mattress, pulling her into his massive chest, burying his face in her neck, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. He rocked her, weeping against her skin, holding her like she might vanish into smoke if he let go. "I've got you," he whispered frantically into her hair. "I've got you. You're safe. You're mine." But as Aylin lay against his chest, her heart beating a steady, healthy rhythm once more, she didn't hug him back. Her arms remained limp at her sides. She stared blankly over his broad shoulder at the cracked stone wall. And as the color returned to her face, something in her eyes had fundamentally changed. The soft, hopeful girl who had stared at him in the great hall was gone. Because some wounds don't heal, just because the blade is removed. Chapter 4. Aylin survived. But the girl who opened her eyes 3 days later in the royal wing of House Frost was not the same Aylin. She woke to the sensation of heavy silk sheets and the overwhelming, suffocating scent of pine and winter frost. She wasn't in the drafty servants' quarters anymore. She was in the king's own chambers. A massive, cavernous room dominated by a roaring fireplace and deep velvet drapes. Beside the bed, sitting in a heavy oak chair, was King Asriel. The most terrifying alpha in the Northern Territories was asleep, his head bowed, his large hands clasped together in his lap. He looked entirely undone. His usually immaculate dark hair was a mess. Dark purple shadows bruised the skin beneath his eyes. He hadn't left her side. Not once. Aylin shifted slightly, the rustle of the silk incredibly loud in the quiet room. Asriel's head snapped up instantly. His icy blue eyes went wide, flashing with a desperate, frantic gold before settling on her face. "Aylin," he breathed, the word a ruined rasp. He was out of the chair in a heartbeat, dropping to his knees beside the mattress. He reached out as if to touch her, his massive hands trembling, but he stopped himself just an inch from her skin. "You're awake. By the gods, you're awake." Aylin looked at him. She felt the mate bond pulsing between them, a steady, healed rhythm keeping her heart beating. She felt his overwhelming relief, crashing against her senses like a tidal wave. She felt his love, his guilt, his absolute desperation. But inside her own chest, there was nothing. No warmth, no butterflies, no shy, fluttering hope. Just a vast, freezing ocean of distance. "I am awake, Your Majesty," she said quietly. Her voice was perfectly smooth, perfectly hollow. Asriel flinched as if she had driven a dagger between his ribs. He lowered his hands, his jaw tightening as he searched her face for the girl who had looked at him with such adoration in the great hall. But she wasn't there. "Aylin, please," Asriel whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't call me that. Not after everything. I claimed you. You are my mate. You claimed me. Ellen replied, her expression completely unreadable. So your heart wouldn't stop beating, Azriel? The king went pale. No, he said fiercely, shaking his head. No, I claimed you because I was a blind, arrogant fool who didn't realize that you were my entire soul until I was holding you as you died. I love you, Ellen. The words hung in the air. I love you. Days ago, those words would have made Ellen weep with joy. Now, she simply stared at the canopy above the bed. The healers say I need to rest, she said softly, turning her face away from him. Azriel swallowed hard, his throat working as he fought down the agony tearing through his wolf. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor. Rest, he murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears. I'll be right outside. I won't leave you. I swear it on my life. He walked out, pulling the door softly shut. Ellen didn't watch him go. Days passed, blurring into weeks. Ellen healed physically. The colour returned to her cheeks, her hair regained its shine, and her steps grew steady. But emotionally, she was an impenetrable fortress. Azriel showered her with the wealth of the kingdom. Maids brought her gowns of velvet and spun silver. Trays of roasted meats, sweet pastries, and exotic fruits were left at her door. He gave her a suite of rooms fit for an empress, overlooking the frosted mountains. But the kingdom expected a grand celebration. The Alpha King had reclaimed his true mate, right? The curse of the fractured bond had been broken. Yet, whispers spread through the castle corridors like a toxic fog. Because Lady Bianca was still in the palace, the Council of House Frost had intervened. They argued that the political treaties signed with the Southern Lords could not simply be tossed into the fire. While Azriel spent every waking moment obsessing over Ellen's recovery, Bianca continued to walk the halls with her chin high. She still wore the ceremonial silver crown of the chosen bride. She still dined at the high table. And Ellen? She didn't fight for the crown. She didn't demand Bianca's exile. She didn't throw fits of jealousy or claim her rightful place at Azriel's side. She simply existed, walking the halls like a beautiful, silent ghost. It confused everyone. A true mate should be fiercely territorial. A true mate should be demanding her throne. Azriel couldn't take the silence anymore. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Iron Ridge, he found Ellen standing on the balcony of her suite. The freezing wind whipped her dark hair around her pale face, but she didn't seem to feel the cold. Azriel stepped out onto the stone, stopping a careful distance away. His chest ached with the need to pull her against him, to bury his face in her neck and breathe in her scent. But her scent had changed. It used to smell like warm earth and sweet rain. Now, it smelled like ozone, like the sharp, crackling air right before a devastating winter storm. "You should be by my side," Azriel said quietly, his deep voice barely carrying over the wind. "In the great hall. The council is gathering for dinner." Aelin didn't turn. "I prefer to eat here." "You are my queen, Aelin," Azriel said, taking half a step closer. His wolf whined, begging for her attention. "You belong at the head of the table, with me." Aelin finally turned. She looked at him, her dark eyes entirely devoid of emotion. "I was your queen, Azriel," she said softly. "You just didn't choose me." Azriel's breath hitched. "Aelin, I took it back. I claimed you, I saved you." "You chose her for power," Aelin said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "And you chose me for survival. Neither decision was out of love." "That is a lie," Azriel snarled, the alpha slipping through, his eyes flashing gold. "I love you. My wolf screams for you every second of every day. Your wolf screams for its mate, Elin corrected, stepping past him toward the doors. But the man? The king? He chose the crown. She walked inside, pulling the glass doors shut, leaving the most powerful alpha in the realm standing alone in the freezing cold, shattering into a million pieces. Chapter 5. Aelin didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't tear her lavish rooms apart in a fit of broken-hearted rage. She did something far worse. She became untouchable. It started at dawn 2 days later. The castle was still shrouded in dark, freezing fog when Aelin walked down to the royal training yards. She wasn't wearing her velvet gowns or her silk slippers. She wore fitted leather trousers, thick boots, and a simple linen tunic. The guards in the yard, massive, battle-hardened warriors of House Frost, stopped their sparring to stare at her. This was the weak, wolfless girl who had collapsed in the great hall, the fragile thing the king was keeping locked away like a porcelain doll. Aelin walked straight to the weapon racks, her face a mask of absolute calm, and picked up a heavy, blunted training sword. She turned to the nearest guard, a hulking brute named Owen. "Spar with me," she commanded. Owen blinked, looking around nervously. "My lady, I cannot strike you. The king would have my head on a spike." "The king is not here," Aelin said. She didn't raise her voice, but something in her tone made the hairs on the back of Owen's neck stand up. "Raise your sword." Owen hesitated, lifting his blade with a patronizing smirk, intending to go incredibly easy on her, to disarm her in one swift move. He swung. Aelin didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She moved with a liquid, terrifying grace that shouldn't have been possible. She ducked under his heavy swing, pivoted on her heel, and drove the hilt of her sword squarely into Owen's ribs. The massive guard gasped, stumbling sideways. Before he could recover, Aelin swept his legs out from under him. Owen hit the frozen dirt with a heavy, humiliating thud. The entire training yard went dead silent. Aelin didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stepped back and looked at the next guard. Again. Day after day she trained, and day after day something inside her fundamentally shifted. The trauma of the rejected bond, the literal experience of her soul dying and being violently ripped back into her body, had changed her wolf. Her wolf had once been small, timid. But you cannot drag a creature out of the grave and expect it to remain soft. Her wolf was feeding on the coldness inside her, mutating into something sharper, darker, ancient. The same girl the court had once completely ignored began to command the atmosphere of the castle without saying a single word. When Aelin walked down a corridor, conversations died. When she looked at a passing noble, they instinctively lowered their eyes, their inner wolves forcing them to submit to a pressure they couldn't even name. And Asriel watched it all, absolutely powerless. He stood on the high balconies overlooking the training yards, gripping the stone railing so hard the rock actually cracked and crumbled beneath his fingers. He watched his mate move like a lethal, beautiful weapon. He watched her lay out his best soldiers, her dark hair plastered to her sweat-slicked neck, her chest heaving. His wolf snarled, pacing frantically inside his mind. "Mine," the beast roared. "Go down there, claim her scent, show them she belongs to the king." Asriel's breathing was ragged. He wanted nothing more than to jump down into the dirt, wrap his massive arms around her waist, and kiss her until she melted against him. But he couldn't. Because the one time he had walked down into the yard, the one time he had stepped onto the dirt and asked her to spar with him, Aelin had simply stopped. She had dropped her wooden sword, bowed with perfect glacial politeness, and walked away without looking back. "She is starving me out," Asriel whispered to Soren, who stood quietly beside him on the balcony. Soren looked down at Aelin, his expression grave. She is building her own armor, sire. She realized that relying on a king's protection is what nearly killed her. Asriel closed his eyes, a low, wounded sound escaping his throat. He was the ruler of the North. He commanded thousands, but the only woman he wanted had built a wall of ice around her heart that not even his fire could melt. Chapter 6. The tension in the palace finally reached its breaking point during the winter solstice banquet. The great hall was packed with the highest nobility of the realm. Chandeliers blazed overhead, casting a warm golden glow over the long tables laden with roasted meats and rich wine. But the atmosphere was suffocating. Asriel sat rigidly on his throne at the head of the hall, his dark fur cloak spilling over the armrests. His icy eyes were fixed entirely on Aelin. She stood near the massive stone fireplace, holding a goblet of dark wine. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that clung to her curves, her dark hair falling in loose waves down her back. She looked breathtaking, untouchable. And directly across the room, simmering with humiliated rage, was Lady Bianca. Bianca had noticed the shifting tides. She had noticed the way the guards bowed lower to Aelin than they did to her. She had noticed that Asriel hadn't so much as looked in her direction in weeks. But Bianca was a daughter of the South. She was proud, arrogant, and foolish. Determined to assert her dominance, Bianca pushed away from her sycophantic ladies-in-waiting. She smoothed the front of her emerald gown, adjusted the silver crown sitting on her blonde hair, and marched directly across the hall toward Aelin. The chatter in the room began to die down. Nobles turned their heads, smelling the sudden spike of aggression in the air. On his throne, Asriel went perfectly still. His hands gripped the armrests. "Don't do it," his wolf growled, staring at Bianca. "Take one more step toward my mate, and I will tear your throat out." But before Asriel could stand, Aelin caught his eye across the room. Just a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Stay out of this." Asriel froze, bound by her silent command. Bianca stopped 2 feet away from Aelin, her lips curving into a sickly, venomous smile. "You look well, Aelin," Bianca said, her voice artificially loud, carrying across the now silent hall. "It's so lovely that the king allowed you to remain in the palace. I suppose even a king feels pity for a beggar." Aelin didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her wine. Bianca stepped closer, the cloying scent of jasmine flooding the space between them. "Don't get too comfortable in those silks," Bianca sneered, dropping her voice to a harsh whisper meant for the surrounding nobles to hear. "You may be his unfortunate biological mate, but I am still his chosen queen. Don't ever forget who wears the crown." The court held its collective breath. Everyone stared at Aelin, expecting the weak, soft-spoken girl from the servants' quarters to shatter. They expected her to cry, to flee from the hall in shame. Instead, Aelin smiled. It wasn't a gentle smile. It was cold. It was predatory. It was a smile that made the hairs on the back of Asriel's neck stand straight up. Aelin handed her wine goblet to a terrified servant standing nearby. She turned her body fully toward Bianca. "You're right," Aelin said, her voice smooth as dark glass. "You were chosen." She tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes locking onto Bianca's pale ones. But not by fate, and certainly not by strength. Bianca scoffed, opening her mouth to deliver a venomous retort. But before a single word could leave the southern lady's lips, before the guards could even twitch, Aelin released her aura. It didn't roll out slowly, it detonated. It slammed into the great hall like a physical shockwave. The air pressure in the room plummeted instantly, sucking the breath from hundreds of lungs. The massive fires in the hearths flickered, shrinking down to violent blue embers. The The sheer, crushing weight of Aylin's power hit the crowd like a collapsing mountain. It was dark. It was ancient. It smelled of ozone and winter storms and the freezing, merciless edge of the grave. Bianca gasped, a horrible, choking sound. Her knees buckled instantly, and she crashed to the marble floor, her hands clawing at her own throat as she tried to breathe under the overwhelming dominance. All around the hall, Alpha Lords, battle-scarred generals and arrogant nobles dropped to their knees, their inner wolves forcing them to submit to a pressure so intense it made their bones ache. Even Azriel, the Alpha King, froze on his throne. His own massive, feral wolf went completely still in absolute shock. Because this power, this was not normal. This was not the aura of a standard mate. This was the aura of a true, ancient Luna, warped and darkened by the trauma of surviving a severed soul. "I almost died on a cold floor because of your crown," Aylin said softly. Her voice carried through the silent, suffocating hall like a death knell. She stepped over Bianca, looking down at the trembling woman on the marble. "And when I was in the dark, something inside me didn't come back the same." Aylin's eyes flickered. For a fraction of a second, the warm brown shifted into a glowing, unnatural, piercing silver. Something wild, feral, and incredibly dangerous stared out from behind her face. "I am not the weak girl he rejected anymore," Aylin whispered. With a slow, deliberate breath, Aylin pulled her aura back. The crushing pressure lifted instantly. Nobles gasped, collapsing against the tables, clutching their chests as oxygen rushed back into the room. Bianca lay sobbing on the floor, the silver crown having tumbled from her head, spinning away across the marble. Aylin didn't spare it a glance. Without looking at Bianca, without looking at the terrified court, and without looking at Azriel, she turned and walked out of the great hall. Sitting on his throne, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs, Azriel finally understood the true, devastating depth of his mistake. He hadn't just lost her once when he spoke those words of rejection. He was still losing her. He had broken a sweet, gentle girl, and the universe had returned a lethal, untouchable queen who no longer needed a king. Chapter 7. That night, Azriel found her alone. She was standing on the high battlements of the astronomy tower. No guards, no crown, just her, staring out into the endless, dark, freezing forest of House Frost's territory. He didn't announce himself as the king. He didn't bring Soren. He walked out quietly, leaving his heavy fur cloak and his silver crown inside on a velvet chair. Out here, in the biting cold, he was just a man. A desperate, terrified, completely shattered man. He stopped a few paces behind her. The wind whipped her dark hair, carrying that new, terrifying scent of ozone and winter storms directly to him. His wolf whined, a pathetic scraping sound against the inside of his ribs. "I don't expect forgiveness," Azriel said. His voice was rough, scraped raw from nights of screaming her name in his sleep. Aylin didn't turn. She didn't even flinch. Still, nothing. Azriel took half a step closer, his boots crunching softly on the frost. His voice broke. "But I will earn it. I will spend the rest of my life, every single day, every single hour, proving that choosing you is the only thing that ever actually mattered to me." Aylin finally turned. She looked at him. There was no anger in her face. The terrifying, crushing lunar aura she had unleashed on Bianca in the Great Hall was completely tucked away. What was left was a mask of smooth, calm, infinite indifference. "You already had a lifetime, Azriel," she said quietly. The words were soft, but they hit him with the force of a battering ram. "And you wasted it." She didn't wait for him to respond. She simply stepped past him, her shoulder brushing his arm, and walked back into the warmth of the castle. She didn't look back. From that day on, Asriel changed. He didn't try to win her with words. Words meant absolutely nothing to her anymore. He changed with actions. The very next morning, Asriel stood before the High Council of House Frost. He officially stripped Lady Bianca of her titles, her ceremonial crown, and her place in the palace. He banished her back to the south with a terrifying finality. When the council erupted in fury, slamming their fists on the mahogany tables, threatening civil war and broken treaties, Asriel let his own feral aura fill the chamber. The shadows in the room elongated, the temperature plummeted below freezing. "The next man who mentions that woman's name," Asriel snarled, his eyes glowing pure, murderous gold as he stared down his oldest advisors, "will lose his tongue. Aelin is the only queen of House Frost. If the South wants war over a spoiled girl, let them come. I will drown them in the snow." He protected Aelin fiercely, but from the shadows, even when she didn't ask. He executed 2 assassins sent by Bianca's humiliated family before they ever reached the inner courtyard. He ensured the training grounds were cleared of any soldier who looked at her with anything less than absolute reverence. But Aelin? She didn't care. She built her own power. She formed her own alliances with the guard captains, sparring with them until her knuckles bled and her muscles coiled with lethal strength. She spent hours in the library, learning the kingdom's history, its trade routes, its vulnerabilities. She carved out her own identity entirely separate from the Alpha King. She didn't need Asriel's protection. She no longer needed him. And that was his absolute greatest punishment. Because now, the question running through the hushed corridors of the palace wasn't, will the king choose her? It was, will she ever choose him again? The Alpha King had everything: endless territory, absolute power, the unquestioning, terrifying loyalty of his armies. But the one woman the moon goddess had handed to him, the only woman his soul screamed for, looked right through him like he was made of glass. Asriel stopped sleeping entirely, not because of the threat of southern armies, or the whispers of his political enemies, because of her. Everywhere he turned, he saw Aelin. He saw her training in the courtyard, moving like liquid shadows. He saw her walking past him in the corridors without so much as a glance, her chin high, her scent completely locked down. He saw her laughing with someone else. Chapter 8. It started as a rumour among the perimeter guards. Then Asriel saw it with his own eyes. A visiting dignitary had arrived at the fortress, Alpha Orion of House Stormborn. A man known for his rugged charm, his lethal strength, and his famously untethered mate status. Asriel stood on the high balcony overlooking the training yards, his hands gripping the stone railing. Below him, Orion had stepped into the dirt. He was handing Aelin a new, perfectly balanced wooden training sword. Asriel watched, his vision tinting red, as Orion leaned in. The Stormborn Alpha said something low, a crooked smile playing on his lips, and Aelin smiled back. It was a real smile, warm, genuine, the kind of bright, breathtaking smile she used to give Asriel before he had ripped her soul apart on the marble floor of the Great Hall. Asriel's wolf snapped. A low, dangerous, guttural growl tore from his chest, vibrating against the stone of the balcony. His claws extended involuntarily, biting deep into his own palms until hot blood dripped onto the frost-covered stone. His eyes went entirely black. Something primal, fiercely territorial, and utterly desperate clawed at his throat. His wolf was screaming at him, begging him to jump down there, to rip Orion's throat out, to throw Elin over his shoulder, carry her to his chambers, lock the heavy oak doors, and bury his face in her neck until she remembered she was his. Mine. His wolf roared. Kill him. Claim her. But Azriel didn't move. He stood frozen, his massive chest heaving, shaking with the violent, agonizing effort of his own restraint. Because for the first time in his life, the Alpha King knew he had absolutely no right to claim her. He had forfeited that right the moment he chose the crown over her heart. That night, Azriel couldn't take it anymore. The image of her smiling at Orion was burning a hole through his sanity. He went to her room. He didn't knock. He pushed the heavy door open, his breathing heavy, erratic, his eyes wild. Elin was sitting by the roaring fire, calmly brushing out her long, dark hair. She paused, looking at him through the reflection of her vanity mirror. She didn't look scared. She didn't look surprised. I can't breathe without you, Azriel said. The confession tore out of him like jagged glass, bleeding into the quiet room. Elin didn't even turn around. She calmly set the silver brush down on the vanity. You could, she replied, her voice terrifyingly steady, perfectly flat. You did. That hit him harder than any physical wound ever could. The truth of it gutted him. Azriel crossed the room, his massive frame shaking. He didn't stand over her. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't use his alpha presence to command her attention. The Alpha King dropped to his knees. A king, a conqueror, a man who had made entire armies bow before him. On the ground, at her feet. I was wrong, he said, his voice violently shaking. Tears, hot, desperate, undeniable tears, finally spilled from his icy blue eyes, tracking down his scarred cheeks. I was blind. I was arrogant. I was so incredibly, pathetically weak. Silence filled the heavy space between them. Only the crackle of the fireplace dared to make a sound. I chose power over you. His voice cracked, shattering on the words. He looked up at her, his face a portrait of absolute devastation. And it was the greatest mistake of my miserable life. Elin finally turned in her chair to face him. She looked down at the massive, broken man on her floor. Her eyes weren't angry. They weren't hateful. They were just deeply, infinitely tired. Do you know what it felt like, Azriel? She asked softly. Her voice didn't waver. To stand in that hall, surrounded by people who mocked me, and be thrown away by the one person my soul was literally created to love. Azriel squeezed his eyes shut, a jagged sob catching in his throat. He couldn't speak. He pressed his palms against his thighs, bowing his head. I was dying, she continued, her voice completely hollow. I lay in that freezing room and my lungs burned, and my wolf screamed for you in the dark. And you let me. Each word was a quiet, devastating truth that carved Azriel out from the inside. You want forgiveness? She asked. He nodded, a desperate, pathetic, frantic gesture. He would give her anything. He would cut out his own heart and hand it to her on a silver platter if she asked for it. Then prove it. His chest tightened with a sudden, desperate flare of hope. He looked up, his tear-streaked face finding hers. How? Tell me what to do, Elin. Anything. I will do anything. Elin stood up. She stepped closer to him, close enough for him to smell the ozone and the rain. Close enough for him to feel the warmth of her body. Let me go. Azriel froze. The air left the room. The blood roared in his ears. "If your love is real," she whispered, looking down into his desperate, horrified eyes. "If you actually love me, the woman, and not just the bond, you will choose my happiness." She paused, letting the final, lethal blade slide into his heart. "Even if it's not with you." Everything inside Azriel broke. His wolf howled in absolute, soul-tearing agony inside his mind, thrashing against the cage of his ribs. His chest felt like it was being ripped open all over again. Every instinct he possessed, every dominant, alpha, possessive urge in his DNA screamed at him to say no, to lock the doors, to hold her and never, ever let her out of his sight. But he looked at her face. He looked at the exhaustion in her eyes. He looked at the deep, lingering pain he had put there. And this time, Azriel didn't fight it. He slowly, agonizingly, bowed his head. His hands clenched into fists as he fought down the monster inside him, forcing his wolf to submit to her will. "Then go," he said hoarsely. The words nearly destroyed him. "But know this," Azriel whispered. He looked up, his eyes burning with a raw, broken, unconditional love that he had never shown to another living soul. "There will never be another mate for me. There will never be another queen of House Frost. Not in this life, or the next." Aelin froze. For the first time since the rejection, he wasn't chasing her. He wasn't forcing her. He wasn't using his authority or his strength or the magic of the bond to claim her. He was letting her choose. And that changed absolutely everything. Chapter 9. Days passed, then weeks. Ellen had packed her things and left the royal wing. She had moved to the outer estates of the territory, taking her time, breathing free air. She trained. She rode horses through the snow. She lived. And Azriel? He didn't send guards to follow her. He didn't send spies to report on her movements. He didn't send Orion of House Stormborn away out of jealousy. He suffered in absolute agonizing silence. He ran his kingdom by day, a cold, efficient ruler, and paced the empty, echoing floors of his chambers by night, a hollow shell of a king. He was broken. But he was quiet. He had kept his promise. 1 month later, the first true blizzard of the season hit House Frost. Azriel stood alone on his balcony, letting the freezing snow coat his hair and his shoulders. He didn't feel the cold. He felt nothing at all. "You kept your word." Azriel's entire body went rigid. The voice came from the shadows behind him, cutting through the howling wind. He turned, slowly, terrified that his mind was finally playing cruel tricks on him. Ellen stood in the doorway of his chambers. She wasn't wearing a crown or royal silks. She wore her dark training leathers, a heavy, snow-dusted cloak draped over her shoulders. She looked wild and beautiful and entirely her own. Hope flickered in Azriel's chest, a painful, terrifying, suffocating spark. But he didn't move toward her. He didn't close the distance. He stayed exactly where he was, his hands gripping the railing behind him so he wouldn't reach for her. "I needed to know," she continued, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. "I needed to know that your love wasn't just control." She stepped out onto the balcony, the snow swirling around her boots. That it wasn't just power, or guilt, or the magic of the bond forcing your hand. She took another step, closer. "I needed to know that it was a choice." Ellen stopped right in front of him. Azriel wasn't breathing. He didn't dare. He looked down at her, his heart hammering a frantic, desperate, echoing rhythm against his ribs. He was terrified that if he moved, she would vanish like smoke. Slowly, Ellen reached out. She slipped her small, warm hand into his large, scarred, freezing one. And this time, Azriel didn't grab her. He didn't pull her flush against his chest. He didn't crush his mouth to hers to claim her. He just let her hold him. He let his thumb rest gently, reverently, against the back of her knuckles. "I'm not the same girl you rejected," she said softly, looking up into his icy blue eyes. "I know," Azriel whispered, his voice thick, tears instantly blurring his vision. "You're a goddess. And I'm not forgiving you easily," she warned, though the ice in her dark eyes had finally, truly melted. A faint, breathtaking smile touched Ellen's lips. The first real smile she had given him since the day in the Great Hall. "But," she tightened her hold on his hand, her thumb tracing the thick scar on his palm. "I'm willing to try." Azriel closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against hers as a long, shuddering, broken breath of pure relief left his body. He wrapped his arms around her waist, gentle and trembling, finally pulling his mate, his equal, his queen, into the warmth of his chest. Chapter 10. Azriel didn't carry her inside. He didn't issue a command. He simply held his hand out, palm up, and waited. Aelin looked at his large, scarred hand, the hand of a conqueror who had finally learned how to be gentle. She placed her smaller hand inside it. Azriel's fingers curled around hers, warm and solid, and he led her off the freezing balcony and into the cavernous warmth of his royal bedchamber. With a wave of his free hand, the heavy oak doors shut and locked. The world outside the castle, the council, the politics, the winter storms, ceased to exist. It was just the two of them, bathed in the golden, flickering light of the massive hearth. Azriel turned to face her. He didn't move closer. He stood there, his chest rising and falling heavily, his icy blue eyes completely blown wide. He looked like a man standing before a goddess, terrified that if he blinked, she would vanish. Aelin took a slow breath. She could feel him through the bond, the roaring, desperate need, the agonizing restraint. He was starving for her, but he was holding his beast back by a single, frayed thread, waiting for her permission. Aelin reached up and unclasped her heavy, snow-dusted cloak. It slipped from her shoulders, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Azriel swallowed hard. The muscle in his jaw ticked. She took a step toward him, then another, closing the vast, freezing ocean of distance that had existed between them for months. When she was inches away, she lifted her hands and placed them flat against his chest. Beneath the linen of his shirt, his heart was hammering so wildly it practically shook his ribs. "Aelin," Azriel whispered. The word was a raw, broken plea. His hands hovered over her hips, trembling, desperate to touch her but terrified of pushing too fast. "Are you sure? Tell me to step back and I will. I swear it on my life. I will step back." Aelin looked up into his eyes. The ice was gone. The arrogance of the Alpha King who had rejected her in the Great Hall was completely, entirely dead. What stood before her was her mate, her equal. "I don't want you to step back," Aelin said softly. She slid her hands up his chest, her fingers tangling in the dark, slightly damp hair at the nape of his neck. "I'm tired of the cold, Azriel," she murmured, her thumbs tracing the tense line of his jaw. "I'm letting the wall down. I want my mate." A low, guttural groan tore from deep inside Azriel's chest. The last thread of his restraint snapped. His massive hands finally clamped down on her waist, hauling her flush against his solid body. He didn't hesitate anymore. His mouth crashed down onto hers. It wasn't a gentle, hesitant kiss. It was an explosion. It was months of starvation, of agonizing guilt, of desperately staring at her from balconies. It tasted like tears and winter and absolute surrender. Aylin gasped against his lips, her body melting into his heat as his tongue swept into her mouth, tasting, claiming, worshipping. She wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on tight as he walked her backward. The backs of her knees hit the edge of the massive, fur-covered bed. Asriel broke the kiss just long enough for them both to drag in a ragged breath. He looked down at her, his eyes burning with a brilliant, predatory gold. But there was no cruelty in the predator, only absolute devotion. "You are so beautiful," he rasped, his hands shaking as he quickly unlaced his shirt and pulled it over his head. Firelight danced across his broad, scarred chest. Aylin reached out, tracing the ridges of his abdomen, and Asriel shuddered at the light contact. He followed her down onto the mattress, his large frame covering hers, caging her in, protecting her from every angle. He didn't rush. He worshipped. His lips trailed burning kisses down her jaw, along her collarbone, finding every pulse point. He stripped away her training leathers with a frantic but reverent care, until there was nothing between them but skin and heat, and the heavy, intoxicating mix of pine, frost, ozone, and rain. When they finally came together, Aylin cried out, not in pain, in overwhelming, mind-shattering completeness. Asriel went perfectly still above her, his muscles corded with tension, his face buried on her neck. He was letting her adjust, letting her feel him. "Look at me," Asriel groaned, propping himself up on his forearms. Aylin opened her eyes, her chest heaving. "I love you," he whispered fiercely, his hips beginning to move in a slow, agonizingly perfect rhythm that made Aylin's vision blur. "I love you, Aylin. My queen, my life, my soul." "Asriel," she gasped, her nails digging into his wide shoulders. The pleasure built impossibly fast, a tidal wave crashing over them both. She could feel his emotions pouring through the bond, his sheer awe, his blinding joy, his fierce protective love. "Claim me," Aylin begged, tilting her head to the side, baring the sensitive skin of her neck to him. "Asriel, please, claim what is yours." Asriel's golden eyes flared. A deep, feral rumble shook his chest. "Mine," he growled. He lowered his head, his lips brushed against her pulse point, and then he bit down. The pain was a sharp, fleeting pinch, instantly swallowed by an explosion of pure, radiant magic. The mating mark. The moment his teeth broke her skin, the bond, the frayed, fractured, broken thing that had nearly killed them both, fused together in a blinding flash of golden light. It snapped into place with absolute, permanent certainty. Aylin screamed her release, her body arching off the bed, shattering into a million pieces of light. Asriel followed a second later, burying his face in her hair as he poured his life, his seed, and his entire soul into her. They lay tangled in the heavy silk sheets for a long time afterward. The fire popped and hissed in the hearth. Asriel held her flush against his chest, one heavy arm wrapped securely around her waist, his hand splayed protectively over her stomach. He was tracing lazy, soothing circles against her bare skin. Aylin rested her cheek against his chest, listening to the slow, steady, powerful thud of his heart. Her heart. Asriel pressed a lingering, tender kiss to the top of her head. He didn't need to say a word. The bond humming between them, bright and warm and unbreakable, said everything. She was his. He was hers. And nothing in this world or the next would ever tear them apart again. Epilogue. 2 years later. The terrifying silent fortress of House Frost was currently Very loud. A tiny, dark-furred wolf pup skidded across the snowy courtyard, tumbling over its own oversized paws in a frantic sprint. Right behind him, Asriel, the ruthless alpha king of the north, was actually laughing. "Got you, little menace," Asriel roared playfully. He lunged, scooping the pup high into the crisp winter air. In a flash of magic, the wolf shifted mid-air, landing safely in his father's massive arms as a chubby, dark-haired boy. Valen grabbed fistfuls of Asriel's tunic, his face split into a massive grin. "Again, Papa! Again!" Aelin watched from the heated stone balcony, her hands wrapped around a mug of spiced tea. She rested one hand over the gentle swell of her stomach. Another baby. A little girl this time. She looked out at the courtyard where she used to hide in the shadows, the weakest girl in the pack. Now, she was the Luna, and her life glowed with warmth. Asriel set Valen down to play with the guards and bounded up the stone steps. Breathless, his hair a messy disaster, he looked wildly handsome. He dropped to a crouch in front of Aelin, pressing a tender, lingering kiss right to her baby bump. "She's quiet today." His deep voice rumbled against her skin. "Unlike her brother," Aelin smiled, running her fingers through his snow-dusted hair. Asriel stood, wrapping his massive arms around her waist and pulling her flush against his chest. "I was thinking," he murmured, burying his face in her neck, "about the day you stood on this balcony and made me earn you. I was an arrogant idiot." "You were," Aelin agreed fondly, "but you learned how to listen." Asriel let out a happy, ragged sigh. He didn't care about appearing cold or ruthless to the northern lords watching from the windows. He kissed her, slow, deep, and drowning in reverence, right there for the entire pack to see. He didn't need to be the most feared man in the realm anymore. He had the only strength that mattered. He had her. And that is the story of how the invisible girl conquered the heart of a ruthless alpha king. It turns out, the strongest bonds aren't forced by fate. They are made of forgiveness, and they are made by choice. Asriel learned that power is nothing without love, and Aelin learned her own infinite worth. Thank you so much for listening to The Alpha King Chose Another Woman. If you loved Aelin's journey, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps the channel so much. Can we take a moment to talk about Aelin's revenge in the Great Hall? When she finally unleashed her true lunar aura and dropped Lady Bianca and half the council to their knees, I got actual chills. Do you think Bianca got exactly the humiliation she deserved, or should Aelin have banished her right then and there instead of leaving it to Asriel? Tell me your thoughts below. I'm Amy Sterling. Remember, you are worthy of love, exactly as you are. I'll see you in the next story. Bye!